Language is powerful. We use language to communicate messages. We use language sometimes to express concerns, fears. Some people use language to express their hatred. Many times language is used to show concern and a calming influence. Language can divide people or it can unite people. Language can define who you are or who you are not. My mother told me about what happened when she was a child. To really understand this story, you have to know that my parents were both born in Ohio. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in Ohio, and even the previous generation was already here. But they lived in a small rural community here in Northwest Ohio, and they all spoke German into the 2nd and 3rd generation. So both of my parents grew up in the very early part of the 20th century, still speaking German. That was the language everybody in the community spoke. And Mom would leave her home and walk to the one-room schoolhouse where everything was taught in German. That was life in those days. But then one fateful day, when Mom was about 10 years old, 1917, when the United States declared war against Germany, Mom went to school, and all of the textbooks that had been in German were being burned and replaced with books in English. And from then on, classes were taught in English. They would walk home, and it was still in German. The family would speak German, go to school, and it would be English. And I asked my mother if that was hard for her to adjust, and she said, well, the teacher was very caring and very helpful. For her, it was kind of a challenge. She enjoyed learning a second language, but there were kids that were left behind who just didn't make it. She always bemoaned the fact, however, that was the decision that was made by the powers that to be, to define the people that they were not German and could not take the side of Germany in this war, but that they were Americans, so the textbooks were burned. Language can define who we are or who we are not. In the first reading today, Acts of the Apostles, we have the story of the first Pentecost. And of course, there's the wonderful image of the wind and the Holy Spirit and the tongues of fire over the apostles. But the primary image that comes out as the manifestation of the Spirit is one of language. A language that unites. A language that allows people to understand. It's really an incredible story. All these people are gathered in Jerusalem. And it says, we are Parthians, Medes, and Elamites. Well, if you look that up, that's modern-day Iran. Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Then there's people from Pontus and Phrygia and Pamphylia. That is Turkey. Cappadocia, that's Greek. There are people from Arabia, people from Africa, Libya, Cyrene. There are people from Rome, and it goes on and on. So various continents are represented, lots of people are represented, lots of different languages. And here's the amazing thing. This is what really struck me. It wasn't that they all had to learn the language of the disciples. They all heard the disciples in their own language. So yes, there's unity, but there was also diversity. Unity is not the same as uniformity. There can still be diversity. And the language that was there defined the people, not just from the place they were from, but the language now was the language of Christianity, the language of the Holy Spirit. So what I've been thinking about is, it's not one language versus another, so much as what is the language of the Holy Spirit? What is the language that transcends boundaries? And I think right off the top, it's got to be the language of enthusiasm and commitment. Can you imagine these disciples, these Galileans, that they went out and they preached? That takes a great deal of courage the power of the gift of courage from the Holy Spirit. But even more so, that they must have spoken with such conviction that people were attracted to it. They offered a message of hope. They talked about Jesus having died, but risen from the dead. Talk about hope. We all need that. And then, of course, the language that transcends everything else is the language of compassion and love. I remember Bishop Ottenweller, who was one of the priests of our diocese and eventually became the Bishop of Steubenville. But I remember him as a parish priest. And he was known 60, 70 years ago as the priest of our diocese for the Hispanics to go to. And it was in the early years of Latino ministry in the Northwest Ohio. And people went to Father Ottenweller because he was the one who could help them out. And here's the amazing thing, as I got to know him, a wonderful man, but he didn't speak much Spanish at all. But he had a big heart, or as we used to say, very simpatico. And that's what attracted people. Compassion goes beyond the barriers of various languages. That is the language of the Holy Spirit. That's the language of universality. That's the language of oneness. And that defines the followers of Jesus. In 1887, a man named Dr. Zamenhof from Warsaw, Poland, decided to create a universal language. It's called Esperanto. And he put the language together. He had a bunch of followers, and pretty soon it actually took off. It had modern success. It was intended to be a universal secondary language, that people would still have their primary language, but we could all go into a secondary language to communicate with each other. It was moderately successful for a while, and then it dwindled completely, although there are still some people in the world who still speak Esperanto. We don't need a secondary language. We need a primary language, a language of unity, a language that reaches out and crosses over, a language that defines us as one people driven by the Holy Spirit to make a difference in this world.